And I apologize because I know that the PowerPoints are in a horrible order, and I have no idea as we work through them what I might skip, simply because I don't know why I put it in there. I think I made notes to myself is what happened. And the notes ended up in a PowerPoint because that's what I was looking at the moment. So instead of writing it down, I said, well, I'll make a PowerPoint out of it, and that'll help me remember. So some of it may be completely nonsensical. But I wanted to look at the process in the Torah portion because we saw it back when the purchase is made there of the field and the cave at Hebron. And how the text literally says that the trees in the field stood up when Abraham made that purchase, and it said it was seen in the eyes of all who were present. And we know that Hebron is understood to be the portal or the entrance back to the lower garden. So the idea of the patriarchs and the matriarchs being buried in that location, it's a location marker. It's a place of significance. And I meant to actually put a slide in here. Maybe I can slide it in there before tomorrow of some pictures that were taken deep in the cave with a little Jacob activity. There was a little subterfuge involved in getting those people down there to take the pictures, but there are bones down there and some pottery. And the building, the structure that you see over the cave today isn't the actual burial place. It's in caves below. And if I can get that slide on there, it'll show you the layout of it. And so there is a descent as you go down there. Because, you know, with these monuments, like if you go to the tomb of Rachel, the building that's there is obviously not the burial place of Rachel. It's going to be underground someplace, but the building itself will mark the spot. And it just seems every time we get close to Hebron, whether we're talking about Caleb making war with the giants for that location, and then later we see that he comes in and that is his portion in the land when he's able to return. It's because he was willing to make war for the giants. He was willing to stand up in the congregation and say, we can do this. He believed in the resurrection. He had visited Hebron. He had visited the burial place of the patriarchs. And because of what they did, and I don't think it's any accident in the daily prayer, we start out with the Avot. We mention Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then it goes on basically to another resurrection prayer. Once you understand the significance behind Hebron, then you automatically start thinking, when you hear of that place, or you hear the burial place for the patriarchs and matriarchs, you start thinking in terms of resurrection, in terms of ascent. And we'll see a little bit of that in this Torah portion, because after the dreams, Jacob is actually going to be sent. The text says, and reading out of the Art Scroll, he says, so he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he arrived at Shechem. And there's an anomaly there. Hebron is not a valley. Hebron is always a place that you go up to. When you put it back into context and you look at the places in Scripture that talk about Hebron, unless you're talking about the cave itself, there's something to think about. You're actually talking about a place that you ascend to, or in the case of Abraham purchasing the field and the cave and the trees and so forth, the text says that they literally stood up. So with Hebron, we always think of that as being in a higher place. But in this week's Torah portion, in Vayeishev, we see him sent from the valley of Hebron. So he's being sent from a deep place of Hebron. So we'll look some more at the cyclical nature, and I took that at Hebron. Don't pay any attention to the little letters there. It's just a dedication, like the family that paid for the whatever that is, the curtain, the whatever. But we've been talking about Tent Sarah, how part of this resurrection picture started with Abraham's bosom, Sarah's tent. And as you go into Hebron, this was, I think I told you about this a couple weeks ago, how it's called Ohel Abraham Vesarah. It's the tent of Abraham and Sarah. So you know what my question is. Is it the tent of Abraham? Or is it the tent of Sarah? Yes, it is. So here's our pattern that we've looked at before. There's going to be a recurrence of themes. So we have to understand that from the beginning, the pattern is that the Bible is always going to repeat itself. And remember the old saying, the Torah is the prophecy, and the prophets are its legs. So you don't really go to the prophets to read prophecy. You go to the Torah to read the original prophecy. And then when you get to the prophets and the writings themselves, they will help to clarify the prophecy that you have read. Maybe we could start a new movement. You know, people are always starting movements. Let's start a back to the Torah prophecy movement and say you can't have a prophecy conference unless it starts with Genesis 1:1. Period. That's the prophecy. So looking at that pattern, we don't just see a pattern in the Torah that we see later. We see the pattern even repeated within the Torah itself. For instance, say you're my sister. Why does that keep cycling through? Because of what we're learning every time we hear that phrase. The phrase, who are these? That phrase keeps cycling through. Why? Well, after we've read it a couple of times, we'll realize who these are. In fact, we might get far enough into Psalm 126 tonight, which is prayed as the blessing after meals. You're going to pray Psalm 126 as an added song or an added part of the prayer of the blessing after meals on Shabbat. So if you're an observant Jew, every single Shabbat, you will be singing Psalm 126, Shir HaMalot, which is a song of what? Going up. A song of ascents. What have we been talking about ever since even the last Torah cycle? Resurrection. We're taking it back because the Torah is a prophecy of resurrection. So we're not going to ask, when will this prophecy be fulfilled? We're going to ask how many times. And that's when we do things like sing Psalm 126 week after week after week after week. Is it vain repetition? Or are we learning something about prophecy in that process? Are we also learning about the Feast of Sukkot, the seventh feast on Shabbat? Are we learning about a messianic kingdom when we sing Shir HaMalot? So we're going to break that prayer, that song down, since it is a song of ascents, and we're going to try to see it as related to the life of Joseph, as part of his experience. And then in tomorrow's class, if we have time, we're going to do another chart. I know I didn't do the chart with you guys last week. I did the chart with the Tuesday class, but I did send you a template where you could do the same thing that we did. And I thought it would be fun because there was really almost everything fit into certain places. And the only difficult part would have been when you got to the genealogy of Seir, the house of Seir and Edom. And there was so much incest in it. That's why I say you kind of need a commentary to be able to place those passages into the chart. And most of them are going to be going into zeal, right? Because there's a passion involved there. But without looking at that pedigree, so to speak, it doesn't really stand out. I would say most people would put it in, I don't know where it goes. But everything else pretty much had a proper place in terms of, is this making peace? Is this appeasement? Is this making war? Or is this prayer? There was very little I saw that I just wasn't sure where it went. But this is part of the process. We don't say, when is this going to be fulfilled? We say, how many times, so that we're not surprised. And so that we don't mind doing things like saying the daily prayer daily. There's so much prophecy in the prayers. Why? Because they're scripture. We're praying the prophecies over and over. And trust me, the longer you pray the prayers, whether we're talking about the daily prayers or the special prayers that maybe go with Shabbat or that are in the Maksur that you might be doing annually, the longer you do them, the more likely you are to do that V8 slap on the head, like, how did I miss that all this time? It'll just dawn on you what it's talking about because you're praying the prophecies. So just as a reminder about 10th Sarah, because we're going to continue following that thread of resurrection. And say if we have time tomorrow, we'll do a comparison chart so that I can show you that Joseph's life is parallel to Jacob's. In fact, I'm going to take it out of Bereshit Rabbah, which is a midrash. And the rabbis have already done the work for us. They've done the research, and they can give us point by point how that Joseph's life in many ways is a repeat of Jacob's. But I want to pull in some other things too, because Esther's life is going to be related not just to Jacob's. She's a Benjamite. She's a descendant of Rachel. Her life is going to have parallels with Joseph, with Benjamin, with Sarah. The most obvious one being one that we've already pointed out, that Sarah dies at age 127. And Queen Esther, who inherits that promise from Sarah, is going to be passed down to her through the tribe of Benjamin. She's going to be a mother of many nations. As it turns out, Esther is going to be a queen over 127 provinces. So again, not will prophecy be fulfilled, but how many times? And we're going to go back to these rivers of Eden. Let me make sure I've got my handy dandy movable menorah here. I'm going to take it back to when we really started talking about the rivers as being part of this whole resurrection picture. It goes back to Bereshit 15:18. It says, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt, which is the Nile, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. Remember, the great river, when you see that in scripture, if it doesn't say Euphrates, you can take for granted normally that it is the Euphrates. If it just says the great river, it's still the Euphrates. And we know from Genesis 2 that it's describing to us rivers of Eden. We know that the outer, let me stop sharing here for a sec, because I'm not sure how well you can see on that little video. If we're looking at the rivers of Eden, we know that it had an outer river, which was called the Pishon, and it's Sabav. That's the description of it. It goes around and around and around. The Pishon, the rabbis say, is the Nile, in the physical realm. The Pishon is describing a spiritual type of river in the lower garden. The lower garden is concealed from us right now. But in the physical realm, if we look at the Pishon, we can look at the Nile and say, oh, we can learn something about the Pishon River of the lower garden if we look at the Nile River itself. It's called the Pishon, they say, because of the Pishton, the flax that grew on its banks. But the Parat River, if you'll remember, it didn't have any description at all. Like the other rivers, they had a description of how they moved. Circle, circle, walk. Holech. So Pishon, and then Gichon, Chidekel. So this would be the Tigris, this little inner one, and that's the one that says it just walked. These circled. This one walked. But of this one, there's no description of how it moved. It's just there. And it's called the Parat Euphrates. Well, we know in the physical realm where the Euphrates is. And I say it's comical when people are using geography to try to figure out where the rivers of Eden are. All they'll ever find is physical rivers. You have to look a little higher to find the rivers of Eden. They're not going to reflect properly in the physical realm what's found in the lower garden. But this Parat River, it means fruitfulness. And if you'll remember, your 3 feasts, your 3 foot festivals, the Chagim, Passover, the season of Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, those are foot festivals. Each is characterized by a first fruits offering. So what do we have here? A Parat, a fruitful river that's going to do what? That's going to supply fruit. Remember reading that in Revelation? How the trees can grow on either side of the river? And that sounds kind of crazy. How does that happen? Well, I don't know how it happens, but I know when you start moving those rivers around, it starts to make better sense because they're a circle. Okay, just wanted to refresh your memory on how it looked, kind of. I actually have somebody working on a motion graphic right now that's going to light up those rivers as we read through Genesis 2. As it discusses the rivers, she's going to make it where it'll light up like fire, like a fire water river. Nahar is a river. It means burning and shining. So that it'll actually be 3-dimensional. And then once the rivers are in place, and once we described what's within those rivers, like the good gold and the bdellium and so forth, she'll actually be able to make those rivers start turning like Ezekiel's wheel within the wheel so that people can see what it actually kind of would have looked like in that realm. It's kind of hard to imagine in 1D, if that's what we're in right now, because I'm having a hard time imagining it. At any rate, I think that'll help. I think Genesis 2 needs to be seen and Genesis 1 needs to be heard. It works better that way with the text. So we've got some boundaries here. The river of Egypt, the Nile, that outer river. And then he talks about the river Euphrates, which is actually a source river that's running in. It says it's going to become these 4 heads. So we've got the rivers of Eden in the physical realm, symbolized by the physical realm, the Parat and the Pishon. All right, and a little more review here from Bereshit 24:10. It says, then the servant took 10 camels. Remember, he's going to find a bride for Isaac. It says he took 10 camels from the camels of his master and set out with a variety of good things of his master's in his hand. If you'll remember, the rabbis say this was a document. This was like a deed, a guarantee, because the servant couldn't literally take everything that belonged to Abraham in his hand. So what did he take in his hand? He took the written document. He took the testament of what would be deeded to Isaac, and therefore what Isaac's wife would be a part of. And it says he arose and went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. And I think I used the same graphic as I did before so that you could see there the rivers, Naharim, that's highlighted there. And so being there between those two rivers, all right, Naharaim, it means two rivers. The two rivers there would have been the Chidekel, or the Tigris River, and then the Euphrates, or the Parat, just like we were shown in Genesis 2. And then it adds a little trivia for us to make us laugh, I think. It says the city of Nahor. And you will never forget what Nahor means, because it kind of sounds like what it is. Nahor is like to snore. So this was a sleepy little town. All right, we're talking sleepier than Mayberry RFD. So Nahor, snore. Now you know a Hebrew word. And it might be an important one. So as we look at those two rivers where Rebecca lived, remember, she's going to inherit tent Sarah. The rabbis say it's a proper name. It's not Sarah's tent so much as it's tent Sarah. Rebecca's going to inherit tent Sarah. She's going to inherit the miraculous bread, the dough. She's going to inherit the presence of the Shekhinah, and she's going to inherit the lights of Shabbat. And if we look at those two rivers, if we go back to our lesson on Genesis 2, where Rebecca lived, the bride of Isaac, she lived between two rivers. The Tigris there, and if we, which, I wonder if I've got, there, that helps, I think. I don't know, maybe it's just a big mess, but it's as close as I could get till we get the graphic finished up here. But you can see where Rebecca would have lived, between the Euphrates, or the Parat River, and the Chidekel. So she's really living in that interior portion. I mean, right inside the heart of the lower garden. Now, did Rebecca live in the lower garden? No, but it's giving us prophecy. It's giving us a reference point for her spiritual condition, how much different she was than the house and the sleepy little town that she grew up in, which she may not have grown very long in that town. But at any rate, we can see we've got resurrection pictures here. Because if we look at the Chidekel and we would overlay the 7 feasts, we would see the Chidekel would represent the first fruits of the barley. And the Parat, the Euphrates, would represent the first fruits of the wheat. But if you look at the Chidekel, if you can envision it going all the way around in an unbroken circle, if you continued around with it to the other side of the menorah, it would correspond to Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets. So the Chidekel, what does it represent? Both the first fruits of the barley, the resurrection of Yeshua. You go across. It also represents Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, the other first fruits from the dead, right? Because that's what Yeshua came to do, to resurrect the greater body. So one doesn't really stop, it just keeps going. It goes around in a circle. It has the same thing. First resurrection of Yeshua, and then the resurrection of the greater body that has yet to happen. But there's specific things associated with it. And but let's go back just to embed this idea that we're reading prophecy. Our first mention here of the rivers is going to be in Genesis 2. And so we can go here and look at, I believe this is Psalm 24:2, where it talks about the seas and the rivers. But if we go back up here to our reference point, I'm having trouble here because when I show you that whole picture, it means I can't see anything. It says in Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all its people belong to him. For he laid the earth's foundation on the seas and built it on the ocean depths. The NASB didn't really do a great job in the translation on this. And that's why I wanted to go ahead and pull up the interlinear so that you could see, or if you can read the Hebrew, hopefully you can read the Hebrew and go back up to the Hebrew text, where he's talking about the rivers, Neharot. He's talking about the seas, Yamim, and the rivers, Neharot. So when he creates the rivers of Eden here in the Psalm, which again, it's helping us understand the prophecy of Genesis 2, he tells us how the earth was established upon the rivers. Which rivers? Well, he's mentioned how many? The rivers in Eden. Those are the ones we're concerned with. And the word there, kun, that's the word for establish, where it says he established it on the rivers. What do we need to know about the rivers? Let me advance it here. Let's look at that word and the way that it's used. 85 times, right? If you go with how it's used most frequently, a lot of times that'll help you get the right idea and then go back to the context and try to find the nuance. But we can see in the definitions, it's to prepare something, not just to establish it, but to prepare it, to establish it for a purpose, to get it ready for something, to fix it in place for something that's going to come next. He makes it secure to get ready. He's arranging it. It's kind of interesting here. One of the definitions is to be settled, right? He's establishing these rivers from the beginning, and he's establishing the world, the creation upon these rivers, and making it burn, fixing it in place. So whatever is happening in Parashah Vayeishev is occurring because it was set up and it was established way back at the very beginning, way back at our creation. He prepared to set these wheels in motion in a circle, so to speak, so that as we go through these cycles, reading the Torah, and we can see how things are repeated, that we can understand from the beginning it was set up that way. In fact, if you want to say right or yes in Hebrew, you're going to say some form of kun. You're going to say nachon. In fact, if you take a true and false test in Hebrew, you either answer nachon or lo nachon. It's either established or it's not established. And if you're not sure, there's no word for that. There's no C. It's A or it's B. You know, it's nachon or it's lo nachon. There's no yes in that world where everything's true, at least not in modern Hebrew. I think everywhere else we got a shot at that. So let's look at the first mention of it. this prophecy preparation and the rivers of Eden. Our first mention is going to be in Genesis 41:32. It says, "Now as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about." Now, we've read a little bit ahead. This is in a future Torah portion. But just reading that, saying, okay, the first reference of kun, which refers to the rivers, and how this world has been established to go in cycles, I'm a little worried now. Because Joseph is going to have a repeating dream. It's not that the two dreams are identical. It's that the two dreams have identical themes. By the time we would read this, we would already know that Joseph had a repeating dream. How does Joseph know that it's going to be brought about quickly? Because it happened to him in a bad, bad way. Talk about Jacob's trouble. You notice how Jacob seems to have more trouble when he goes into the land? There's a reason for that. In a nutshell, we could just stop this right here, close up Bereshit, set it to the side and say the short story is you're going to descend before you ascend. End of story. But we're here, so we'll keep reading. Prophecy is fulfilled because it's predetermined. And it suggests that it does go all the way back to the creation of the lower garden when he creates these circles of the earth, these wheels within the wheels of the burning rivers. In fact, it's understood that when you cross over, when you die, that you do have to cross that burning river to go back into the garden. That's part of the process. And everything we do is in cycles, so that will finally dawn on us that he fulfills things in cycles. So if we want to understand what's happening to us today, or if we want to understand something that might happen to us in the future, then we have the foundation that he built it on. Way back in Genesis 2. Actually, back in Genesis 1, like I say, Genesis 1 is written at more of a physical level. Genesis 2 is giving more of the spiritual level. And even in modern Hebrew, like I said, I wanted to do Psalm 126. And I know not all of you can read the Hebrew, but if you can, just take a quick look. And this is just Google Translate, so that you could see the list of, even in modern Hebrew, how many of these words are going to pop up. Because, of course, our Torah portion is Vayeishev. And you don't want to cast that net too wide and say anything that's got two letters that look similar, there's going to have some similarity. Sometimes it's just hints. All right? He's going to give you hints. So words like lashuv, to return, to go back, to come back, or to repeat. Lishnot, to repeat. Lehashnot, to repeat. And I'll back up here so you can see that Shana in Hebrew is a year. But it's also a change. So which one is it? Yes, right? And that's why it's always great. You don't have to tell people how many years old you are. You just tell them how many changes you are, because you're going through a cycle, all right? This cycle for me is a little more wrinkly than the ones 30 years ago, but it's still just cycles. That part of who I am is not aging. It's just the physical body that's aging. So we'll go go back to our snoring hint, because Rebecca helped us with that. It says in Daniel 12:2, and by the way, this is where the rabbis, this is one of the foundational texts that even before the first century, but the Jewish sages used to establish a doctrine of resurrection, not just in the Bible, but, and not just in the prophets, but saying if it's being said in Daniel, it's because the prophet Moses said it. Daniel's merely clarifying what Moses has already said. And you say, well, isn't it clear there's a resurrection? No, it's not clear. We had the tzaddikim, we had the Sadducees in the first century who denied the resurrection. To this day, we've got atheists who are 100% convinced. I watched a program with Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager last week. One is an Orthodox Jew, and I think the other was, he sounds like he's conservative maybe. But Dennis Prager was invited to speak at an atheist convention. And he said, to their credit, they did pay him ahead of time, and he said a lot of religious groups don't. So atheists pay their bills. I guess that's the good thing we can say about them. But he said the first thing he asked them when he got up on the stage, he said, how many of you are 100% sure that there is no life after death? And he said, instantly 500 hands shot up. And he said, and we're supposed to be the religious ones? You guys are fanatics. There's no doubt in your mind that you are nachon, that you are correct. But he said, to be an Israelite means to struggle with God. It means to wrestle with him. It means to doubt. So at least for them, one thing he asked, he said, how many of you are hoping you're wrong? He said, at least show me you're honest, because who wouldn't want to believe they would see their loved ones after death? Even if you didn't believe you would, wouldn't it be a nice idea? But for everybody, it's not an apparent doctrine of the Torah, resurrection from the dead. And I think we're only understanding it because we are breaking it down into Hebrew texts and looking for key words or key phrases and so forth. We allow the rabbis to speak into the conversation and to offer evidence. In the Pharisee book that's coming out, I'll have, I think there's 3 foundational texts from the Torah itself, like may Reuven live and not die. And not die refers to the world to come. We would probably never piece that together by ourselves. But the rabbis knew if Daniel is saying there is a resurrection, then it must have been preached in the Torah in some way. So they go back and they start looking for what they missed. So Daniel says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. So there is the fundamental doctrine of the Pharisees, that there will be a resurrection, there will be a judgment, and there will be a reward. And we could add to that a belief in angels, which an angel also appears in our Torah portion. But remember the dust of the earth, that's going to represent the number of Abraham's offspring. But according to Daniel, not all of them are going to be resurrected to just a great everlasting life. I don't want to get into that debate with anyone. We've got other ones that Paul, when Paul writes, often he acts like we should already know these things, and we would if we use the same sources and learning sources that Paul did. He says, I don't want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep. Remember that I'm talking fast tonight because I'm trying to get a lot of stuff in. But remember, Nahor is snore. All right, Rebecca had to be taken from a people who were asleep. They were so asleep, they were snoring. So asleep is going to mean something. We know that it's an equivalent expression to death, but then we have to actually understand what sleep is before we can understand what death is. He says, I don't want you to grieve as the rest who have no hope, for if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have fallen asleep. So it's pretty clear here, Paul is equating being asleep with death. We can see that even in figures of death or patterns of death. Both Adam and Abraham had to be put into a deep sleep in order to be awakened to their mirror doubles. We saw that Adam turns to Chava. He says, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. We're one, but we're two. With Abraham, he has the covenant between the pieces, which is one animal, which is cut and then made into a mirror image of itself. And then we see Abraham and Sarah receiving almost exactly the same promises, the same blessings. Genesis Rabbah 78 says, the fact that we awake from sleep is some evidence of the resurrection. Now, that's a little cryptic. So let's break down what they might be saying. When you're asleep, it's not the same level of consciousness as when you're awake. But it doesn't mean you're unconscious. There's still a lot of things going on. In fact, if you were hooked up to machines that could measure your brain waves, it would be quite obvious that there was a level of consciousness even while you were sleeping. Right? So death is going to be like sleep. It's going to be a separation. I mean, yeah, we'll make y'all all sleepy now. You'll have to wait for the resurrection for the rest of this lesson. Death is going to be the separation of your consciousness from your body. And that's what it feels like when you're asleep. If you're dreaming, see, we got lots of dreams in this portion. Talk about dream, dream, dream. Dreams going on. It's a dream of ascent. The dream causes descent. And then a dream causes ascent. So it's... So sleep and death are similar, but they're not identical. A sleeper will dream. That's the message we get. They're dreaming at a different level of consciousness than when they're awake. But when you're dreaming, it is as though you're not in your body, but you think you are. How many of you have ever run from monsters in your sleep? I have. I remember when I was a little kid, I remember I had a yellow bedspread and a canopy bed. It had all these ruffles and things, and I was probably running from the ruffles. But I remember I went through a period where I ran from the monsters at night. You might talk in your sleep. Why? Because you believe you're having a conversation with someone, and you're not. You're only having it with yourself and in your mind and your consciousness. You might feel like you're falling. Something's happening in your dream and you feel like you're falling. Now, if you wake up on the floor, you really were falling. Even those things can kind of merge. You know, if there's pain in your body, you can dream things that have to do with that pain. So there's a level of consciousness when you're sleeping and when you're dreaming. So let's look at this And I'm going to stop for just a second so I can check time. And we're almost out of time. Okay, I'm going to have to go through most of it probably with tomorrow's class then. However, I just wanted to show you how many things it's not easy. Well, it started from the beginning. Don't look, it'll make you dizzy. This is where I intend for us to end up tomorrow. In Psalm 126. And that's a lot of colors and a lot of arrows. But I wanted you to be able to relate them to some of those words that mean to cycle around, to return, to come back. And I don't know how many of you have a Shabbat Siddur that has the Birchat Hamazon in it, at least with an English translation. But if you don't, it's worth getting one. And I'll have one embedded into the PowerPoints for tomorrow's class, because I think it's at the very end of the presentation. But it's good if you can look at the Hebrew letters, because this is where we want to go. But you can hear, in fact, if I just say it, I think you can hear a lot of those words that I pulled up for you. And even one of these phrases, like, who are these? Remember that phrase kept coming up? Esau asked Jacob, who are these? The children, the blessing. Jacob is going to bless Ephraim and Manasseh. And he asked Joseph, who are these? Well, Dad, it's the two kids you called for. It's not that he doesn't know who they are. He's asking a prophetic question. Who are these? Basically, the question of the prophets is, who are these? Where did these come from? Who has begotten me these? Who are these who fly like doves to their lattices, going back to Jerusalem? End time prophecy. But Psalm 126 uses a kind of a strange expression, im ele. He's done these great things for these, with these. These is an important phrase when it's applied to Israel. So the Song of Ascents, it gives you a clue right off the bat that there will be hints to the resurrection in it. Like I say, this is where I want to go with tomorrow's class. But if you have time, if you have an interlinear, or if you can pull up an interlinear, say, Blue Letter Bible, because that's what I did with this. I pulled it up, and then I made it get big with my hands, whatever that's called. And once it got to a certain size, I took a screenshot of it, and then just stuck it onto the PowerPoint so that you could see the letters better, and so I could, because I'm having trouble with small print, and I never know where my glasses are. If I had my glasses, I could find them. But if you don't know the song to this, it's worth learning. It's a beautiful song. It's a beautiful melody. And you'll find yourself singing it through the week. It's such a beautiful song of ascent, of going up. You want to embed the resurrection into your spirit. Start singing this song, not just on Shabbat. Start singing this song, and it'll start to dawn on you. And there's even what do you call it? Homophone, when two words are spelled differently and they mean something different, but they sound alike. Going back to our theme of Tent Sarah and Tent Rebecca and Tent Rachel, and all the little prophetic things we saw with that succession, even here, Imanu means with us. But if you put an aleph in there, Imanu, It's our mother. And as you look at the life of Joseph, it doesn't just parallel the life of Jacob, it's going to parallel Sarah's life. It's going to parallel Esther's life. He's going to have a lot of these characteristics of the matriarchs. And so that influence of 10th Sarah, you can see, has been handed down even through Joseph, the sons of Rachel. It says, Shir Hamalot b'shuv Adonai et shiratzian hayinu kechomim az yimalet zechopinu ulshonenu rina az yomru v'goyim higdil Adonai la'asot imele higdil Adonai la'asot imanu hayinu smechim shuv Adonai et shvitenu kafikim b'negev. And by the way, the streams in the Negev, if your version says south, it's Negev, which is the desert. And the time that you would have streams in the desert is going to be at Sukkot. It's when the rains start falling. So as you look through Psalm 126, think about Sukkot. And everywhere those green arrows are is because you're supposed to be thinking about Sukkot. Hazorim, Bedima, Berina, Yiksoru. Halok Yelech Uvacho Nose Meshech Hazoram Bo Yavo Yavo Berina Nose Alumotav. And that double go, Bo Yavo, there's going to be another double bow in the Torah portion, and I'll have that set up on the PowerPoints for you tomorrow too. And again, hopefully pull all the fragments together for you so you can see how this is going to fit in terms of the feasts. There's the English. It says, when the Lord brought back the captive ones of Zion, we were like those who dream. That's the connection I want us to make with Yosef. With his dreams, the dreams activated his descent. That's how he knows to tell Pharaoh. The machine's already going, dude. All right, because it was established from the beginning. It says that our mouths were filled with laughter and our tongues with joyful singing or joyful shouting. Then they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us. We are glad. Restore our captivity, O Lord, as the streams in the south. The south there is the Negev. And it doesn't mean make us captive again. I'll have the Hebrew broken down on a different PowerPoint slide. So there's a different translation that you can remember, because it sounds like you're asking him to take you back to captivity. That's not what he's doing. It says, those who sow in tears shall reap with joyful shouting. He who goes to and fro weeping, carrying his bag of seed, shall indeed come again with a shout of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. So the sheaves and the dream we see in Psalm 126. The captivity we will see in the Torah portion. We won't see the turning back of the captivity. And we'll look at those word origins too, because that word there for captive, it doesn't just mean that you're a captive. It means you're a captive who was once prosperous. You once had something that has been taken away from you. And I think that's going to make a whole lot of sense when we start looking at the bigger picture of the resurrection and what we had in the garden, what we lost, and we were taken captive. We know death has taken us captive. It's changed our experience. It's changed us into a being that now has a post-mortem experience, whereas we wouldn't have had before. So we are captive to death until that is turned. And that's part of the process. This is a Joseph psalm, and this is a messianic psalm. And we're going to pull in those themes there of the captive. We're going to look at the, let me see if I can, where we sow in tears, if you'll remember, is going to be at Passover. Remember the tears of affliction, and then on the Seder plate, you're going to have the salt water to represent the tears that you cried in Egypt. So that encompasses Passover, but count how many times it talks about joy and shouting for joy and singing for joy. When would you bring sheaves in? Well, you could bring barley in here, you could bring wheat in here, but the greatest harvest is going to be brought in at Sukkot in terms of bringing in the sheaves. So we see right there, that's one river. From Passover to Sukkot, that gives you that outer river of Eden. So what is it saying? It's also going to affect what's in the middle. It's going to experience like bookends. Passover and Sukkot will tell the story of everything else that's going to happen within those rivers of the lower garden. And with Joseph's name, we get that hint. Yosef. Another name for the Feast of Sukkot is the Feast of Asif. You hear the same root of it, because he will add lots of people. We'll look at Solomon's prayer when the house, the temple is dedicated, even for the foreigner. Why? Because he will add at Sukkot. It's the Feast of the Nations. But Rachel's other son, Benjamin, his first name is Ben-Oni. What do you eat at Passover? Halachma anya, the bread of the poor, the bread of suffering. So Rachel's children, they'll give you the big picture, because Passover is connected to Sukkot. See, if you look at it in terms of the rivers of Eden, there's no beginning and there's no end. It just keeps going around and around. And that's the way prophecy works. It just keeps going around and around. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording here.